Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation, each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries.
Jake never imagined how much his life could change in a matter of seconds. As a maintenance worker at Woodridge Park for over 5 years, he had seen everything from minor vandalism to lost children, but this day would haunt him for the rest of his life. The early morning fog was thick as he approached the entrance gate of the park. The clock on his phone read 6:15 a.m., and as usual, Jake was the first one there. The mist hung low over the park, curling around the playground equipment like something out of a dream. But today, the fog felt different, heavier, more oppressive. Jake unlocked the gate and stepped inside, pulling the rusty chains behind him with a metallic rattle that echoed in the stillness. His breath puffed in front of him as he walked, the air cold and damp after a night of rain. In the distance, about 100 yards away, he saw a figure near the playground. From where he stood, it looked like a woman. She was motionless, standing under the monkey bars, staring down at the ground. At first, he assumed she was a morning jogger, maybe taking a break or stretching, but something about her posture seemed off. Her head was hanging low, her shoulders hunched unnaturally. An umbrella lay, discarded on the ground, beside her, like it had been carelessly dropped. As Jake walked closer, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, a growing sense of unease began to settle in his chest. He quickened his pace slightly, telling himself that everything was fine, that there was a reasonable explanation for what he was seeing. But his gut told him otherwise. When he was about 50 feet away, the truth became clear, hitting him like a physical blow. The woman wasn't standing. She was hanging. Jake froze, the realization seizing him in place. The woman dangled from a jump rope that had been looped over the monkey bars. Her feet were barely 6 inches off the ground, swaying slightly in the cold morning breeze. Her hair, long and dark, was plastered to her face from the rain, her skin pale and lifeless. His heart raced in his chest as he fumbled for his phone. With shaking hands, he dialed 911. The dispatcher picked up immediately, but Jake struggled to find the words. His voice cracked as he tried to explain what he was seeing. "There's a woman," he stammered. She's hanging from the playground. She's dead." The dispatcher's voice remained calm, guiding him through the conversation, asking him to describe the scene and provide his location. But Jake's mind was spinning. This wasn't supposed to happen here. This was a place for kids, a safe spot in the neighborhood, not a stage for tragedy. "Can you check if she's cold?" the dispatcher asked. Jake hesitated. The thought of touching her made his stomach churn, but he knew he had to do it. He approached slowly, his pearls thudding in his ears. The jump rope was a bright neon color, the kind kids used to skate on the playground. It looked so out of place wrapped around her neck. His hand trembled as he reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm. The coldness of her skin sent a shock through him, confirming what he already knew. She had been out here all night, in the rain, in the dark, alone. "She's cold," he whispered into the phone, his voice barely audible. "Very cold." The dispatcher told him to wait where he was until emergency services arrived. Jake stepped back, his legs feeling weak beneath him. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the woman. Who was she? Why here? Why now? He glanced at the parking lot on the other side of the park, where in less than an hour, parents would start arriving to drop their children off at the elementary school next door. He could already picture the chaos if someone else had found her, especially a child. Jake's mind swirled with questions. What had driven her to this? Why had she chosen this park, this playground, of all places? He thought about his own life, how mundane it felt most days, and suddenly, that routine seemed like a gift. Whoever she was, whatever had led her to this point, she hadn't been as lucky. The minutes felt like hours as he waited for the police and paramedics to arrive. The fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around him, isolating him in the surreal silence of the early morning. He could hear his own breathing, shallow and quick, mixing with the faint sound of sirens in the distance. When the first police car pulled into the park, Jake finally allowed himself to exhale. Two officers got out and approached him, their faces serious but calm. Jake pointed toward the playground, his hand still shaking. "She's over there," he said quietly. "I didn't touch her, except to check if, you know." The officers nodded and walked toward the playground while Jake stood back, watching. The scene felt detached from reality, like he was observing it from outside his own body. One of the officers radioed in, and soon the area was swarming with paramedics and detectives. Jake gave his statement, explaining how he had found her, the exact time, and how he had called 911. The officers asked if he had noticed anything unusual leading up to the discovery, any strange cars in the area, anyone hanging around the park at odd hours. Jake shook his head. The park was quiet most mornings, especially this early. Nothing about today had seemed out of the ordinary until her. As the paramedics carefully lowered the woman's body to the ground, Jake turned away. He couldn't bear to watch them handle her like a broken doll. Instead, he focused on the fog, still clinging to the park like a shroud. It felt suffocating now, as if the park itself was trying to hide what had happened here. One of the detectives approached Jake, a notepad in hand. "We'll need to ask you a few more questions, Mr. Larson. Just routine, of course. Are you okay to stick around for a bit?" Jake nodded, though he wasn't sure if he really was okay. His mind kept replaying the moment he realized she wasn't standing, but hanging, the sickening drop in his stomach, the coldness of her skin. He wasn't sure he'd ever shake the image from his head. Jake couldn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned in his bed, the image of the woman's lifeless body hanging from the playground etched into his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, wet and pale, her dark hair matted against her skin. The silence of the night was oppressive, suffocating, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the weight of what he had witnessed. The next morning, Jake arrived at the park much later than usual. His supervisor had given him the day off after the incident, but Jake had felt restless, unable to stay at home with his thoughts. The park, despite the tragedy, was where he felt most at ease, where his routine provided him with some sense of normalcy. As he walked through the entrance, he noticed the yellow police tape still cordoning off the playground. A couple of officers stood nearby, talking quietly among themselves. Jake kept his distance, not wanting to intrude, but his curiosity got the better of him. He glanced toward the playground, where the swings and slides were eerily still in the morning fog. "Jake," a voice called out from behind him. He turned to see Detective Marshall approaching. The detective was a tall, stocky man with a stern expression and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Jake had spoken to him briefly the day before, but now, seeing him again, Jake's stomach tightened. "Morning," Jake replied, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "I was hoping you'd stop by today," Marshall said, motioning for Jake to walk with him. "There are a few more questions we need to ask, just to clarify a couple of things from yesterday." Jake nodded, falling into step beside the detective as they walked along the gravel path. The fog was thick again today, rolling in from the nearby woods and swallowing up the edges of the park. It felt like the whole world was closing in around them. "We've been trying to piece together the timeline," Marshall began. "The woman wasn't carrying any identification, so we're still working on figuring out who she is. But based on what we know so far, it looks like she was out there for several hours before you found her. Probably since around midnight." Jake shivered, imagining the woman standing under the playground, alone in the dark, while the rain poured down. What had she been thinking in those final moments? Had anyone seen her before it was too late? "Do you have any idea who she might be?" Marshall asked, glancing at Jake. Jake shook his head. "No. I didn't recognize her. I mean, I didn't really get a good look, but nothing about her seemed familiar." "That's what we thought," Marshall said. "It's strange, though. No one's reported a missing person fitting her description, and we haven't found anything in the area that gives us a clue. It's like she just appeared out of nowhere." The words sent a chill down Jake's spine. He had lived in the town his whole life, and while it wasn't a large community, everyone seemed to know each other in some way. For someone to go unnoticed for so long, it didn't make sense. Was it a suicide? Jake asked hesitantly, the question that had been gnawing at him since the moment he found her. Marshall didn't answer right away. They reached the edge of the parking lot, where the yellow tape fluttered in the wind, and Marshall stopped, his eyes scanning the horizon. "That's what we are trying to figure out. There's no obvious sign of foul play, but there are a few things that don't add up. We're keeping an open mind." Jake's heart raced. The thought that someone else might have been involved, someone who had chosen the park as the place to stage this tragedy, made his skin crawl. He glanced over at the playground, the place that had once been filled with laughter and joy, now a scene of haunting silence. "Jake, you were the first one here yesterday, right?" Marshall asked, pulling him back to the present. "You didn't notice anything unusual before you saw her? No strange cars, no one hanging around?" Jake shook his head again. "No, it was quiet, like always. I didn't see anything until I got closer to the playground." Marshall sighed, scribbling something in his notepad. "Well, if anything comes to mind, no matter how small, give me a call. We'll be working this case for a while." As Marshall walked away, Jake stood there, staring at the playground. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all, but no matter how hard he thought, there were no answers. Only questions. The days passed slowly after the discovery, but the tension in the town didn't ease. Word of the woman's death spread like wildfire, and soon, everyone was talking about it, speculating, theorizing, creating their own versions of what might have happened. Some people said it was a suicide, others believed there was something more sinister at play. And then there were the rumors, the whispers about strange sightings in the park at night, shadows moving in the fog, unexplained sounds that made the hair on the back of people's necks stand up. Jake tried to ignore it all, but the weight of what he had seen continued to press down on him. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back at the playground, standing in the cold, staring at the woman's lifeless body. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something, some crucial detail that would explain everything. But no matter how hard he tried, it remained just out of reach. One evening, a week after the incident, Jake found himself drawn to the park again. It was late, almost midnight, and the fog had rolled in thick and heavy, just like the morning he found her. The playground was empty, the swings swaying slightly in the breeze, and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only noise in the otherwise silent park. He wasn't sure why he had come back. Maybe he was hoping to find some sense of closure, some way to make peace with what had happened. But as he stood there, staring at the playground, the eerie silence wrapped around him like a cold embrace. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out to see a text from his friend, Mark, asking if he was okay. It was a simple question, but Jake found himself staring at the screen, unable to answer. Was he okay? He wasn't sure anymore. Before he could respond, a sound broke through the silence, a soft, creaking noise, like the sound of a door slowly opening. Jake froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around, but the fog was so thick that he couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him. The sound came again, louder this time, and Jake's stomach dropped. It was coming from the playground. Slowly, cautiously, Jake stepped forward, his eyes scanning the mist for any sign of movement. The fog seemed to close in around him, thick and suffocating, as he approached the swings. The creaking noise grew louder, more distinct, and Jake realized with a jolt that it was coming from the monkey bars, the same monkey bars where he had found the woman hanging just days earlier. His breath caught in his throat as he reached the playground, his eyes locking onto the spot where she had been. The monkey bars were empty, but the rope she had used was still tied to the top, swaying gently in the breeze. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for the rope, his mind racing. Why hadn't anyone removed it? The police had been here, the detectives had combed the area, but the rope was still there, like a dark reminder of what had happened. He grabbed it, feeling the rough texture against his fingers, and yanked it down, the knot slipping free with a sharp snap. For a moment, Jake stood there, holding the rope in his hands, the silence pressing down on him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a shadow moving through the fog, just beyond the playground. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He turned, squinting into the mist, but the shadow was gone. He stood frozen, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps, as the fog swirled around him. Was someone there? Or was his mind playing tricks on him? He didn't wait to find out. Jake dropped the rope and turned, walking quickly toward the park entrance, his heart racing. The fog seemed to cling to him, following him as he made his way down the gravel path. The cold air beat at his skin, and for the first time since the incident, he felt truly afraid. As he reached the gate, Jake glanced back over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the fog for any sign of movement. The playground was still, the swing swaying slightly in the breeze, but there was nothing else, no shadow, no sound, nothing. Jake shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He was just tired, he told himself. Exhausted from days of restless sleep and constant anxiety. There was no one there. It was just his imagination. But deep down, Jake knew that something wasn't right. Something about that park, the fog, the silence, the woman's death, was wrong. And he wasn't sure he wanted to find out what it was. The days following Jake's discovery were marked by sleepless nights and restless thoughts. The fog had lifted from the park, but it seemed to linger in his mind, clouding every waking moment. No matter how hard he tried, Jake couldn't shake the image of the woman hanging from the monkey bars. Her lifeless body, swaying gently in the morning mist, was seared into his memory. Despite the police investigation, no significant leads had surfaced. The authorities were calling it a suicide, just another tragic incident in a city that had seen its fair share of sorrow. But for Jake, something about the whole situation felt wrong. There were too many unanswered questions, too many strange coincidences. Jake had returned to work at the park, but everything felt different now. The once familiar surroundings, the swings, the benches, the trees, had taken on a sinister quality. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, feeling as if he was being watched. Every creak of the playground equipment, every rustle of the leaves, set his nerves on edge. One morning, about a week after the incident, Jake was working near the playground when he noticed something odd. A small piece of paper, caught in the wind, was fluttering against the fence. Curious, he walked over and picked it up. It was a photograph, worn and slightly faded, showing a woman standing in front of the very same playground. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The woman in the photo looked eerily similar to the one he had found hanging from the monkey bars. His hands trembling, Jake turned the photo over. There was something written on the back, in neat, delicate handwriting, "I'll never forgive them." A chill ran down his spine as he read the words. Who was this woman? And what had happened to her? Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the answers were hiding just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. He knew he shouldn't get involved. The police had already deemed it a closed case, and the last thing he needed was to become obsessed with something that wasn't his problem. But the photograph haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, pale and expressionless, staring back at him. Jake decided to do some digging on his own. He started by asking around at the park, talking to other workers and regular visitors. Most people didn't have much to say, just that they had heard about the suicide, and it was a shame. But there was one older man, a groundskeeper named Carl, who seemed to know more than he was letting on. "I remember her," Carl said, his voice low and gravelly. "Used to see her around here a lot, always by herself. She'd sit on that bench over there, just watching the kids play. Never said much, but there was something off about her." Jake pressed him for more details, but Carl was reluctant to talk. "Look, kid, you don't want to get mixed up in this. Some things are better left alone. But Jake couldn't leave it alone. He started spending more time at the park, watching, waiting, hoping to find some clue that would explain what had happened. The more he searched, the more uneasy he became. It was as if the park itself was hiding something, a dark secret buried beneath the surface. One evening, as the sun was setting and the park was nearly empty, Jake noticed a figure standing near the monkey bars. At first, he thought it was just another visitor, but as he got closer, he realized it was the same woman from the photograph, the one he had found hanging from the rope. She was standing there, staring at the ground, just like before. But this time, there was no jump rope, no tragic ending. Jake's heart raced as he approached her, unsure of what to say or do. But before he could reach her, she vanished into the fog. For the next few days, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He would catch glimpses of her out of the corner of his eye, standing by the swings, sitting on the bench, watching him from the edge of the park. But every time he tried to get closer, she would disappear. His obsession with the woman grew, and it began to affect his work. He would show up late, distracted and distant, his mind constantly racing with thoughts of the mysterious figure. His co-workers noticed the change in him, but Jake didn't care. He was determined to find out the truth, no matter the cost. One night, unable to sleep, Jake decided to visit the park after hours. The fog had rolled in again, thick and heavy, shrouding the playground in an eerie silence. As he walked through the empty park, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the mist, he felt a growing sense of unease. He made his way to the playground, where the monkey bars loomed in the darkness. The air was cold, and the fog seemed to cling to his skin. As he stood there, staring at the spot where he had found the woman's body, he heard a faint whisper. "Help me." Jake spun around, but there was no one there. The park was empty, silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But the voice had been real, he was sure of it. "Help me," the voice whispered again, this time closer. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he searched the darkness for the source of the voice. He was no longer sure if it was his mind playing tricks on him, or if there was something else, something far more sinister, at play. Jake's mind was racing. He had always prided himself on being rational, keeping his cool under pressure. But now, everything was unraveling. That voice, the whisper in the park, had shaken him to his core. He knew that he had heard it, but he didn't understand where it had come from or why it was calling to him. The following days were a blur. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her lifeless form hanging from the monkey bars, the whisper of her voice echoing in his mind. The fear and confusion gnawed at him, making it difficult to focus on anything else. It wasn't just the voice, though. Other strange things had begun happening, small, unsettling details that he couldn't explain. At night, his phone would light up with unknown numbers, but when he answered, there was only silence on the other end. His keys, wallet, and tools would disappear, only to turn up in places he was certain he hadn't left them. Then there were the dreams. In them, Jake would find himself back at the park, standing in the thick fog, staring at the playground. He could see the woman, standing in the exact same spot where he had found her body, but in his dreams, she was alive, always facing away from him, staring at the ground. No matter how close he got, she never turned around. And each time, just before he reached her, she would vanish into the fog, leaving behind only that haunting whisper, "Help me." Jake couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and he needed answers. The police had closed the case, but he wasn't about to let it go. There had to be more to the story. Who was this woman? Why had she killed herself in the park? And why was he the one seeing and hearing things that no one else seemed to notice? Determined to find out more, Jake took a few days off work and started digging into the park's history. He spent hours at the local library, sifting through old newspapers, public records, and anything he could find that might give him a clue. It was tedious work, but he was driven by the feeling that something important was hidden in the park's past. As he went through the dusty archives, a pattern began to emerge. Over the years, there had been a series of strange deaths and disappearances connected to the park. Most of them were written off as accidents or suicides, but they all shared something in common. They had all occurred in or around the playground. A few children had gone missing, their bodies never found. There were reports of others who had taken their own lives there, often under mysterious circumstances. Jake's stomach churned as he read through the accounts. Why hadn't he known about any of this? The park had always seemed like a quiet, safe place, a place where families could bring their kids to play. But now, it felt like something far more sinister. One article, in particular, caught his eye. It was an old, yellowed newspaper clipping from the early 1990s about a woman named Margaret Delaney who had gone missing after leaving her young son at the park to play. Her son had been found hours later, wandering alone, but Margaret was never seen again. The police had launched a search, but no body was ever recovered, and the case went cold. Her disappearance had been a local mystery for years, but eventually, it had faded from memory. The more Jake thought about it, the more it made sense. The woman he had found in the park, could she be connected to Margaret Delaney? The photograph he had found, the one with the message on the back, seemed to suggest that she had some kind of unfinished business, something that tied her to the park. And the fact that she had chosen that exact spot to end her life couldn't be a coincidence. Jake was obsessed now, driven by the need to understand what had happened. He knew he had to learn more about Margaret Delaney and her son. Maybe the boy, now an adult, would have some answers. Jake tracked down the address of Margaret's last known residence and decided to pay a visit. The house was a small, weathered structure on the edge of town. It looked abandoned, with overgrown weeds creeping up the sides of the building and broken windows that had been hastily boarded up. Jake knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He called out, but only silence greeted him. As he was about to leave, an elderly neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Crawford, shuffled out from the house next door. She eyed Jake suspiciously, but when he explained that he was looking for information about Margaret Delaney, her expression softened. "Margaret, now that's a name I haven't heard in a long time," Mrs. Crawford said, her voice tinged with sadness. "Poor thing. Her boy, David, was all she had after her husband passed. When she disappeared, it was like the whole world crumbled around him." Jake asked if she knew where David might be now, but Mrs. Crawford shook her head. "He moved away years ago. Last I heard, he was living somewhere up north, trying to put the past behind him. Can't say I blame him, with everything that happened. She paused, lowering her voice as if afraid someone might overhear. But you know, I never believed she just up and vanished. Margaret was a strong woman, not the type to abandon her child. There was something off about that park, always has been. I warned her not to go there, especially after dark. But she didn't listen. Jake pressed her for more details, but Mrs. Crawford seemed reluctant to say much more. Before she went back inside, she left him with one final cryptic remark. There are things in this world we can't explain, young man. Some places, they hold on to the past, and they don't let go. Jake left the house feeling more unsettled than ever. He had more questions than answers, and he was beginning to wonder if he was getting in over his head. But he couldn't stop now. He was too close to the truth, whatever that truth might be. Over the next few days, Jake continued his investigation. He managed to track down a few old friends of Margaret's, who confirmed that she had been a devoted mother, deeply affected by the loss of her husband. None of them believed she would have left her son voluntarily, and they were all baffled by her disappearance. Then, Jake found a lead that took his investigation in an unexpected direction. One of Margaret's friends mentioned that in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, she had been meeting with a local journalist named Rachel Green, who had been working on a story about the park. According to the friend, Margaret had been uneasy about something, but she had never explained what it was. Rachel, however, might know more. Jake contacted Rachel Green and arranged to meet her at a local coffee shop. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. When Jake mentioned Margaret Delaney, Rachel's expression darkened. I haven't thought about Margaret in years, Rachel said, stirring her coffee absently. I was working on a story about some strange incidents at the park, disappearances, odd sightings, that kind of thing. Margaret came to me because she was worried about her son. She felt like something wasn't right in that park, like there was something watching him. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? Rachel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Look, I don't usually talk about this kind of thing. I'm a journalist, I deal in facts, not superstition. But Margaret was convinced that there was something wrong with that park. She said her son, David, had been acting strangely ever since they started going there. He'd have nightmares, talk about seeing things that weren't there. She thought someone, or something, was following them. Jake leaned forward, his heart pounding. And what did you find out? Rachel sighed. Not much, honestly. I tried to dig into the park's history, but there wasn't anything concrete. Just rumors, stories passed down over the years about strange occurrences. But nothing that would explain what happened to Margaret. She paused, looking Jake in the eye. But I'll tell you this, Margaret was scared. Whatever it was, she believed it was real. And I think she was getting too close to the truth. Jake couldn't shake the unease that clung to him as he left the coffee shop after speaking with Rachel Green. Her words replayed in his head, the gravity of them weighing heavily on him. Margaret had been scared, terrified, in fact, of whatever she had felt was lurking in the park. And now, after weeks of obsessively delving into the mystery himself, Jake was starting to feel the same way. He had gone too far to turn back now, though. There was something here, something dark, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it, no matter what. He owed it to Margaret. He owed it to the woman who had taken her life in the park. And maybe, on some level, he owed it to himself. Over the next few days, Jake doubled down on his efforts. He spent long hours, at the library, at the town hall, and online, combing through records, trying to piece together the fragmented history of the park. The deeper he went, the more disturbing the picture became. The park had been built in the 1950s, but before that, the land had a much darker history. It had once been the site of an orphanage, St. Michael's Home for Children, which had burned to the ground in a fire in 1938. Many of the children had perished in the blaze, their bodies never recovered. The land had sat vacant for years after that, a place locals avoided due to rumors that it was haunted. As Jake dug deeper, he uncovered stories of strange sightings, odd occurrences, and unexplained deaths dating back decades. People spoke of hearing voices, seeing figures in the fog, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread when they visited the park, especially around the playground. Some even claimed to have seen the ghosts of the children who had died in the fire. But it wasn't just the playground that was the source of the rumors. There was also the old well, located on the outskirts of the park, just beyond the tree line. According to local legend, the well had been there long before the orphanage, and it had always been considered a cursed place. Some said it was bottomless, a portal to something dark and evil. Others claimed that it was where the spirits of the dead were trapped, unable to move on. Jake didn't believe in ghosts or curses. He was a practical man, grounded in reality. But the more he learned about the park, the harder it was to dismiss the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the place. It was late one evening, after another long day of research, when Jake finally got the break he'd been waiting for. He had been going through old police records from the 1990s when he stumbled across a file that had been mislabeled and tucked away in the wrong section. Inside was a report on the disappearance of David Delaney, Margaret's son. Jake's heart raced as he read through the file. According to the report, David had gone missing just a few months after his mother's disappearance. He had been staying with his aunt at the time, but one afternoon, he had gone out to play at the park and never returned. The police had conducted a thorough search, but no trace of David had ever been found. His disappearance had been chalked up to a runaway, another tragic case of a boy unable to cope with the loss of his mother. But there was something else in the file that caught Jake's attention. A statement from a witness, a woman named Elizabeth Granger, who had been walking her dog near the park on the day David disappeared. Elizabeth claimed to have seen the boy near the old well, speaking to someone, though she hadn't been able to see who. She described hearing voices, but when she approached, there was no one there, just David, standing by the well, staring down into it. Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine as he read Elizabeth's account. The well, the same well that had been the subject of so many strange stories. What had David been doing there? And who had he been talking to? Jake knew he needed to find Elizabeth Granger. She might be the key to understanding what had happened to David and to his mother. Jake tracked Elizabeth down to a small, rundown house on the edge of town. She was in her 60s now, her hair gray and her face lined with age, but her eyes were sharp, and she remembered the day David disappeared as if it had happened yesterday. "I'll never forget it," she said, her voice low and somber. There was something wrong with that boy. I don't mean he was a bad kid, but there was something off about him that day. Like he wasn't all there. He was just standing there, by the well, talking to someone. But when I got close, there was no one else around. Just him. Elizabeth paused, her expression darkening. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just kept staring down into the well. And then, all of a sudden, he turned and ran off. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought he was just a boy playing games. But when I heard later that he'd gone missing, I knew something wasn't right. Jake asked her if she had ever told the police about the well, but Elizabeth shook her head. They didn't want to hear it. They said he'd probably run away, just like his mother. But I knew better. That well, there's something wrong with it. Always has been. Jake knew what he had to do next. He had to go to the well. It was the only place that might hold the answers he was looking for. He had been avoiding it, afraid of what he might find, but now there was no turning back. It was a cold, foggy morning when Jake returned to the park. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting an eerie glow over the playground. The fog clung to the ground, thick and heavy, as Jake made his way through the trees toward the well. The air grew colder as he approached, the trees closing in around him, their branches twisted and now like skeletal fingers, reaching out to pull him back. But Jake pressed on, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the well now, just ahead, its stone walls, covered in moss and vines, the darkness inside beckoning him closer. As he stood at the edge of the well, peering down into the blackness below, Jake felt a sense of overwhelming dread wash over him. The air around him seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as if the well itself were alive, breathing, waiting. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. He pulled a flashlight from his bag and shone it down into the well. The light barely penetrated the darkness, revealing only slick stone walls and a pool of stagnant water far below. But then, just as he was about to turn away, he saw something. A glimmer of movement, a shadow shifting just beyond the reach of the light. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he leaned closer, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. And then, suddenly, a voice, low and distorted, like a whisper carried on the wind, echoed out from the depths of the well. "Help me." Jake stumbled back, his heart racing. He knew that voice. It was the same voice he had heard that morning in the park. The voice of the woman who had hanged herself. The voice that had been haunting him ever since. Jake knew now that he was standing at the edge of something far darker than he had ever imagined. The well was more than just a hole in the ground. It was a portal, a gateway, to something beyond understanding. And whatever it was, it had been feeding on the park for decades, drawing in the lost, the broken, the vulnerable. But why? And how was Margaret Delaney connected to it? And David? Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden gust of wind, swirling around him, carrying with it the faint sound of children's laughter. He turned, his flashlight sweeping across the trees, but there was no one there. Just the fog, thick and impenetrable. He felt a pull then, an inexplicable urge to step closer to the well, to lean over and peer down into the darkness once more. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the stone, his heart pounding in his chest. "Help me." The voice was louder now, more insistent. And this time, Jake understood. It wasn't just the voice of the woman. It was the voice of the children. The voice of David. The voice of all those who had been lost to the park. They were calling to him, begging him to release them from whatever dark force had claimed them. Jake knew what he had to do.